You're good to go.
Good morning, everyone. Amanda, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Yeah, I think it's been a number of years since I spoke with you all last, and I wish I could be there in person, but this is the next best thing on when I'm in Montreal. So yeah, I today I'm going to spend just under 20 minutes sharing about my first COP or Conference of the Parties International Climate Conference experience. So in case you weren't following COP28, I'd love to just give a high-level overview of what happened, what did we win, and what we lost. Um, so one of my big takeaways from COP was that we were finally naming the elephant in the room, and that parties finally came together and recognized that fossil fuels are uh, the root central cause of climate change. And so that sounds obvious to many, especially those working closely on climate. Um, but that recognition that we have to transition away from fossil fuels in order to address the climate crisis and to give humanity and all living beings a chance at survival through this century. That was a breakthrough milestone to signal politically and socially that the uh, fossil fuel era is coming to a close within the next several decades. Um, but essentially, there were a number of disappointments, and frankly, for a lot of advocates, we did find that the language around phase out of fossil fuels was a disappointment because there was basically a whole spectrum of what was on the table for that global stocktake language. The weakest being no language at all. Sort of the middle ground being transition with lots of loopholes and sort of escape hatches for the fossil fuel industry. And then the most ambitious and aligned with a livable future being a full phase out of fossil fuels. Um, yeah, so basically we did get a very politicized outcome that is not science aligned, but it was still a breakthrough demonstration and political signal that yeah, the world is moving away from fossil fuels. And the faster that can happen, the faster we have a chance at a livable future. So yeah, in terms of other challenges, yeah, there were a number of loopholes that countries will inevitably exploit to avoid or delay actions, including yeah, inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, which is a huge debate within the climate community. Like the question of how should we use so-called like abatement technologies such as carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which has massive problems in terms of how successful it is in actually capturing and storing carbon. So yeah, essentially you have a number of different camps. The fossil fuel lobby and petrostates are yeah, really vying and investing in these mythical and unproven technologies to prolong the fossil fuel era while still appearing that they are doing the work of climate action. So it's a crux issue because it's so deeply confusing to the public. So that was one central task that I had at COP was to draw those lines in the sand and make it more clear to the public and to negotiators and decision makers, um, you know, what solutions and what language are in fact escape hatches that are, you know, masquerading as being green, but are really just throwing us off course. Um, so another major disappointment was on
Emily, just checking in. I think we might have lost your connection. Are you able to hear us, Emily? I imagine Emily will join us again in a second. Please hold. And I'll just make a little announcement to the room that. She's back. Oh, she's back. Fantastic, Emily. Not to worry. I will.
Okay, I should be unmuted now. Can everyone hear me? Excellent. So sorry about that. Um, yeah, as I was saying, the loss and damage fund, which is a central tenant to ensure that developing countries receive the funds necessary to support adaptation and to also yeah, accommodate for the historic burden that they've shouldered with the climate crisis. Um, so yeah, essentially what really stood out to me was Canada's poor, really abysmal contribution to the adaptation fund. Um, so for instance, when the news broke, we were all, sitting there and it was announced by Minister Guilbeault, our environment minister, and many of us thought that we heard an announcement of 60 million, which, we were all messaging each other like in this in-person announcement, and we're like, oh, that's not great. That's much lower than what we were asking for, but well, let's see how this shakes out. Um, but then we realized later when, because I think it was the French accent of Guilbeault, it was actually 16 million, 16, instead of 60. And so it is just such a abysmal marginal fraction of what Canada should be contributing, given its historic role as an exporter and as yeah, a wealthy country that should be contributing to global adaptation. So, yeah, essentially, failure to ramp up ambition on adaptation action and support will only lead to more losses and damages. These two things are inherently interlinked, loss and damage and adaptation. And at the following COP, there's going to be a big focus on finance and ratcheting ambition and global North country commitments to the adaptation fund. So I think there's lots we can do in the intervening time to pressure Canada to step up their commitment. Um, but yeah, essentially it's really skipping over a critical step that could prevent yeah, much more uh suffering and costs. So yeah, that was my very brief overview of some of the key takeaways. We see this incremental but still very significant step with the transition language. And we already see the fossil fuel industry being very, very defensive and uh, grappling with even the investor and market uncertainty of yeah, the outcomes of this year's COP. But in terms of some of my own like personal goals and purpose at COP, yeah, I through my work, I'm very focused on challenging the expansion and the phase out of liquefied natural gas, which is really a carbon bomb being disguised as a bridge fuel, and is being branded by governments as low carbon, when uh, numbers of studies are realizing that its life cycle emissions are equivalent or in some cases worse than coal. So this is yeah, a core focus of mine to challenge the greenwashing around liquefied natural gas and LNG. I was also focused on kicking out big polluters from the COP space. There was a record number of fossil fuel lobbyists at COP this year. And so I was really trying to challenge the social and political license of these blockers the petro provinces, such as Alberta and Saskatchewan, came out in force. Interestingly, Alberta brought a 100-person delegation, which is really unheard of for Alberta to show up at COP in this way. Um, and I think really the lion's share, almost exclusively, the number of fossil fuel lobbyists as part of the Canadian delegation were ascribed to the Alberta delegation. So, that gives you a sense of the lack of goodwill from our petro provinces showing up in COP spaces. And they were really peddling us stories of greenwashing, unfortunately, and lying about their climate record. So that was unfortunate. But yeah, I had a number of personal highlights. So on that front, we were able to nominate Alberta as Fossil of the Day at a key moment during COP. And so this is an award through an international civil society nomination process. And so it's a big room of people that vote on this. And there were a number of other countries that were up on the ballot that day. But it was a bit of a lift on my end because it's unprecedented for subnationals to be nominated as a fossil of the day, and so for international climate society, international civil society to put forward Alberta as a major climate blocker and a threat to the negotiations was quite significant. And so, and that really set up the forthcoming announcement of the federal oil and gas emissions cap really well. It was sort of sandwiched between those 2 days. And so we were able to, put Danielle Smith on her back heels a little bit because she, was at COP really like greenwashing and parading her Alberta's climate plan, but then, of course, gets nominated as Fossil of the Day and throws a temper tantrum when an extremely important climate policy comes out. So her credibility and presence at COP was undermined through those actions. And then in a moment, I'd also like to show an intervention that we staged at a Pathways Alliance pavilion, which is basically the Canadian oil and gas industry in a green trench coat. And it's very confusing because they're trying to convince people and decision makers that they're leading the transition, but they're just investing in Super Bowl ad buys and really ineffective carbon capture projects. So yeah, it was really inspiring to have my colleagues grill their president at a question period in front of press. And the video I'll show you is of KJ, who is a part of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, who is being directly impacted by the Pathways Alliance, poor consultation and incredibly extractive, damaging projects on their lands, and massive tailing spills from oil and gas companies. So if I have a moment here, I'd love to share. Just let me know if the audio is okay. So you'll see the activist to the left from the First Nation, and then to the right is the Pathways Alliance president, who is just awful. So
show to our communities that they can do what they're claiming they can do, all the while getting approvals to expand their production, which grows the largest liability issue in our backyard in Alberta, which is tailings. So tell me how this pathway is actually a pathway to clean up the mess that you're creating in our backyard. Tell me how this pathway is actually going to get us closer to climate justice. Tell me what your companies that you represent, the big five, are doing to go past what they're lobbying. Because what you're doing now is saying industry's gonna last forever, even though we know the CER put out a report that said oil demand globally is going to decline. Tell me how you're preparing for that decline without using CCS as a cover when you do it. Tell me how we're going to get to a cleaner future so that my community and their rights are not eroded because you get to get your CCS and walk away feeling like you need something.
So let me start with the end, if that's okay, on the decline of demand. 100%, we acknowledge that oil and gas demand is going to.
Anyways, his answer is really not even worth listening to, but it was just so inspiring to be amongst such passionate activists, many of whom were directly impacted by the fossil fuel industry and the way in which they're obstructing climate action here and now. So yeah, and there were a number of other personal highlights for me. You know, just being at this venue, which is bubbling with energy, and there were a number of yeah, really important protests and demonstrations, and just opportunities to stage interventions with decision makers that you just recognize from, you know, stalking them on the internet, and then you can get your phone out and record their terrible responses to your questions and send them to journalists. And it was really a truly exciting, invigorating time for me. You know, so I had an interesting interaction with one of the heads of OPEC after they hosted a really yeah, despicable youth fireside chat. And so we had an intervention after that. And yeah, it was also interesting to see on Twitter and at home just the vast outrage from people in the prairie provinces at their governments for spending so much money on going to COP and specifically greenwashing false solutions instead of investing in real solutions at home. So for instance, Alberta, Danielle Smith spends an exorbitant amount of money to follow this COP process, but puts a moratorium on renewable development in her own province. So you know, it's fraught with contradictions. But yeah, in the end, because of the proximity to the Palestine and war in Israel, it was an incredible time for everyone to in international civil society to knit together and call for, you know, really strong messages, to call for a ceasefire, and to be drawing the direct connection between colonialism, climate justice, and war, and ensure that we're yeah, pushing for solidarity for those impacted. So yeah, I think that kind of sums up some of my big highlights. It was a deeply moving and transformative experience for me. Although it is an extremely strange space to practice activism in, because especially in the context of the UAE, you can't, you know, I'm used to doing more radical tactics, but it was extremely constrained. You have to go through a very rigid approval process. And so I felt like we truly made the most of the opportunity, and it's still a yeah, very important venue for civil society to have our voices heard because of the massive amounts of fossil fuel lobbyists and negotiators that are captured by those industries. So to be a sort of watchdog and a force of accountability in that space felt really productive. But yeah, I don't want to take up too much more time. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.